Well, hello, brothers and sisters. It is so good to be with you today. I am Dr. Regina Jennings, and this program is called Readings with Regina. And as most of you absolutely know, I developed this series because I really want to enhance everyone's mind, everyone's intellectualism. Because if your mind is good, normally your body is good as well. So I have a lot to get to today. So I want to start right away with the reading of, where's that book? There it is. The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. But just before I actually go to that book, I want to show you another book that a couple of you have mentioned to me. I talked about this good sister our last time together, and this is Celia. She was an enslaved woman that was raped repeatedly by her owner and her owner's son. And one night, when she knew her owner was coming to her cabin to continue his ravenous raping of her, she had something waiting for him. She had a club, and she clubbed him to death, and then she burnt his body in an open pit on the plantation. Now, this is her book. I won't go into any more about the story, but I did want you to know about Sister Celia because many of you have asked me more about her. So read her story and then you can come back and we can talk about it. Now, I'm absolutely going to get to The Half That's Never Been Told by Edward Baptiste. All right. So we're back with Brother Charles Ball. Remember him? He was the lassoed man. And this particular segment is called To Enslave a Man and the Enslaved Man's Resourceful Defiance. So Charles Ball and the Coffle crossed the river on a ferry west of the city. The two lines, men in chains and women in ropes, walked southwest from Richmond for weeks. One day in Southern Virginia, they passed a road leading up to a low house surrounded by sandy tobacco fields. 100 men, women, and children toiled out there under the gaze of a white man with a long whip. The Georgia man stopped another white man coming up the road. "Whose land is that?" he asked. "Mr. Randolph, a member of Congress." "Whose land is that?" he asked. "Mr. Randolph, a member of Congress." "Mr. Randolph, a member of Congress." "Mr. Randolph, a member of Congress." Owned Black people. The couple kept on. They crossed the Roanoke River, entering North Carolina's Piedmont. Next came a week of hard marching through this land of small farms, passing cornfields and the boys and girls, toiling in them. Then water was sloshing around Ball's feet on the deck of an overloaded flat as a Yadkin River ferryman pulled on the rope, one trip for the men, going back for the women. 3 days marching later, and the Georgia man told them they had entered South Carolina, a place named that was part of the greater Georgia in Ball's geography. Night fell, thoughts of death returned. In the morning, just to make sure they all understood that they had marched into a different part of the world, the Georgia man pried open his compressed lips and made a little speech. They were now too far from Virginia or Maryland to ever get back again, he told them. They must give up all hope of returning. And there was much truth to what the Georgia man said. These 52 enslaved African Americans had now walked into a place that the coffle chain had linked onto the map with streaks of iron oxide from sweat and dirty manacles. Beside the land, they began to see a strange crop growing in the early summer fields. Quote, it looked not unlike buckwheat before it blossoms, end of quote, Ball remembered. This was the cotton plant. In this place where chains marched past plants that looked like food but turned into fiber, they were trapped in a deeper slavery, one shifted into being by 2 decades of Georgia men traveling to and from the Chesapeake when the American Revolution had ended. That's 1776. 20,000 enslaved people lived in the South Carolina backcountry. Now, 75,000 were there. Meanwhile, the Georgia slave plantation was growing too, increasing from 30,000 in 1790 to 107,000 in 1810. The next day, as they walked, a stranger rode up, matching the Georgia man's pace. Quote, nigger for sale? He wanted to buy 2 women. The 2 men negotiated, argued, and insulted each other a little. The new man stared at the women and told them what he thought he'd do with them. The coffle kept moving. The white men rode along, bargaining. Maybe the deal could be sweetened, allowed the Georgia man, if the South Carolinian paid to have the chains knocked off the men. $1,000 for the tool plus blacksmith fees. They stopped at a forge and they kept arguing. The new man stated for everyone's benefit that he had worked African men to death in iron collars. The blacksmith came out and he asked what the 2 gentlemen were making such a frolic about. Ball later said, frolicking? Down there, Ball realized the Carolinians play the time when they were most fully themselves was evidently when they were arguing, negotiating, dealing, and intimidating the enslaved. This was fun for these white guys. For $2.50, the blacksmith would take off the chains. As he knocked off the bolts and the Georgia man unkeyed the locks, the South Carolina buyer took the 2 women away. One was a Calvert woman, the mother of 4. Ball had known her most of his life. He hoped he wouldn't end up with a man as frightening as the one who had taken her. Freed of the heavy iron, Ball was giddy but not happy. 5 weeks in the chains had changed him, just as surely as it had changed the location on the map. The enslaved people toiling in the fields kept their heads down as the new feet from Maryland walked past. He could see that more power hung over them, and now him too. White people now treated Ball as a different kind of property. Under Virginia and Maryland law, the slave had been chattel since the 17th century. Slaves could be sold by their owners, moved by their owners, and separated from others by their owners. Georgia and Carolina cut and pasted many aspects of the Virginia slave code into their laws. But in practice, the laws were implemented differently. Almost all of the slaves down here were new to the whites who owned them, and they used them without constraint. The Chesapeake enslavers were bound by many different considerations when it came to buying or selling human beings. Family ties between enslaved people that were important to other whites, fear of angry slaves, fear of one's evangelized conscience, fear of foreign criticism of the land of the free. Still, by 1805, the coffle chain was breaking that pattern. Even back in Virginia, up and down the path that ran from east to west, north to south, the chain made a person's feet work against him or her. The person in irons became more truly owned by someone else, more easily separated from family, and more easily traded and commodified. The coffle helped make Ball's enslavement deeper and more flexible. It linked his marching feet to the needs of the nation's most successful people. It provided defenses for those who did not want to deal with their own half-hearted moral failure. With the inclusion of slavery in the new state constitutions, the existence of the Georgia man and the Yazoo, I'll explain Yazoo in a minute, as options also made a chain ball into a movable piece in the political, economic puzzle of the young United States. For although Coffles got no closer than Pennsylvania Avenue to the room in which John Marshall read out his 1810 decision in Fletcher versus Peck, their chained footprints walked all over the case file. The technical issue before the court was whether the Georgia state legislature could overturn a contract of sale into which a previous session had entered. Marshall and the court ruled that the people of Georgia could not overturn the sale. The contract might have been accomplished by bribery. It may have contravened the will of the majority of white Georgians, but the sale to the investors' land companies was a sale of property all the same, and property rights, by the Chief Justice's interpretation of the contract clause of the Constitution, was absolute. The people who invested in the company, mostly New England money market types and bankers, should be repaid from the sale of the land, which was now held by the federal government. What this is about, the Yazoo sale was an illegal sale of land in America by English bankers and American politicians. And the land was sold by land speculators to just one or two companies. So this was a point of contention in the political arena. And notice that land is being sold. Well, whose land was it? Whose land was this that these white folks in England and America were selling? This tells you that the Native Americans have been removed. And to say that they were removed is rather kind. They were darn near genocided. Millions of them were killed for this land that these English and American whites are now bartering about and legalizing. Okay, let me read a little more. The principle that a contract is inviolable and that property is absolute was now the accepted conclusion of the federal Constitution. In the Fletcher decision, the Chief Justice never mentioned slavery. But the court's decision made possible the survey and sale of more than 20 million acres for slavery's expanding footprint. Marshall's ruling also gave every future defender of slavery and its expansion an incredible tool. Consider this: if the people of Georgia couldn't overturn a contract born from obvious corruption, how could a legislature or any other government entity take slaves away from their owners? Enslaved African Americans were property acquired by contract according to the law of slave states. Nor, the decision implied, could legislatures constrain enslavers' right to treat said property as being as absolute, as mobile, and as inalienable as they liked. The interlinked expansion of both slavery and financial capitalism was now the driving force in an emerging national economic system that benefited elites and others up and down the Atlantic coast, as well as throughout the back country. All right, now I'm going to read about the enslaved man who attempted to defy slavery. And I'm reading from Blake, or the Huts of America. Now, we remember that Henry changed once his wife was sold away from him. And this is how he was able to strike a blow against slavery. On leaving the plantation, carrying them hanging upon his arm, thrown across his shoulder, and in his hands, Henry had a bridle, halter, blanket, girt, and horsewhip, the emblems of a faithful servant in discharge of his master's business. By shrewdness and discretion, such was his management as he passed along, that he could tell the name of each place and proprietor long before he reached them. Being a scholar, he carefully kept a record of the plantations he had passed, that when accosted by a white as an overseer or patrol, the patrol is the police during this time. He invariably pretended to belong to a back estate in search of his master's racehorse. If crossing a field, he was taking a near cut, but if met in the wood, the animal was in the forest as being a great leaper, no fence could debar him, though the forest was fenced and posted. The blanket, a substitute for a saddle, was in reality carried for a bed. With speed unfaltering and spirits unflinching, his first great strive was to reach the Red River, to escape his own state as quickly as possible. Proceeding in the direction of the Red River country, he met with no obstruction except in one instance, when he left his assailant quietly upon the earth. A few days after an inquest was held upon the body of a deceased overseer, verdict of the jury, by hands unknown. On approaching the river after crossing a number of streams, as the Yazoo, Uchita, and such, he was brought to sad reflections. A dread came over Henry. Difficulties lay before him. Dangers stood staring him in the face at every step he took. Here, for the first time since his maturity of manhood, responsibilities rose up in a shape of which he had no conception. A mighty undertaking, such as had never before been ventured upon, and the duty devolving upon him was too much for a slave, with no other aid than the aspirations of his soul, panting for liberty. Reflecting upon the peaceful hours he once enjoyed as a professing Christian and the distance which slavery had driven him from its peaceful portals here in the wilderness, determining to renew his faith and dependence upon divine aid, when falling upon his knees, he opened his heart to God as a testament of the Holy Spirit. Quote, Arm of the Lord, awake, renew my faith, confirm my hope, perfect me in love, give strength, give courage, guide and protect my pathway, and direct me in my course. Springing to his feet as if a weight had fallen from him, he stood up a new man. The river is narrow, the water red, as if colored by iron rust, the channel winding. Beyond this river lie his hopes, the broad plains of Louisiana, with 100,000 bondsmen seeming anxiously to await him. Standing upon a high bank of the stream, contemplating his mission, a feeling of humbleness and a sensibility of unworthiness impressed him, and that religious sentiment which once gave comfort to his soul, now inspiring anew his breast, Henry raised in solemn tones amidst the lonely wilderness. Could I but climb where Moses stood and view the landscape o'er, not Jordan streams, nor death's cold flood could drive me from this shore. To the right of where he stood was a cove, formed by the washing of the stream at high water, which ran quite into the thicket into which the sun shone through a space among the high trees. While thus standing and contemplating his position, the water being too deep to wade, and on account of numerous sharks and alligators, too dangerous to swim. His intentions were attracted by the sound of a steamer coming up the channel. Running into the cove to shield himself, a singular noise disturbed him. When, to his terror, he found himself amidst a squad of huge alligators which sought the advantages of the sunshine. His first impulse was to surrender himself to his fate and be devoured, as in the rear and either side of the bank was perpendicular, escape being impossible except by the way he entered, to do which would have exposed him to the view of the boat, which could not have been avoided. Meantime, the frightful animals were crawling over and among each other at a fearful rate. Seizing the fragment of a limb which lay in the cove, beating upon the ground and yelling like a madman, giving them all possible space, the beasts were frightened at such a rate that they reached the water in less time than Henry reached the bank. Receding into the forest, he thus escaped the observation of the passing steamer, his escape serving to strengthen his faith in a renewed determination of spiritual dependence. While gazing upon the stream in solemn reflection for divine aid to direct him, logs came floating down, which suggested a proximity to the raft with which sections of that stream is filled. When going but a short distance up, he crossed in safety to the Louisiana side. His faith was now fully established, and thenceforth Henry was full of hope and confident of success. I'm going to read just a little more because this was what Henry wanted to do. He wanted to see the different slave plantations so that he could spread his message of revolution. Approaching Cranes on Little River, the slaves were returning from the field to the gin. Many being females, some of whom were very handsome, had just emptied their baskets. So little clothing had they, and so loosely hung the tattered fragments about them, that they covered themselves behind the large empty baskets tilted over on the side to shield their person from exposure. The overseer engaged in another direction, the master absent, and the family at the great house, a good opportunity presented for an inspection of affairs. "How do you do, young woman?" saluted Henry. "How de do, sir?" replied a sprightly, comely young mulatto girl, who stood behind her basket with not 3 yards of cloth in the tattered relic of the only garment she had on. "Who owns this place?" "Mr. Crane, sir," she politely replied with a smile. "How many slaves has he?" "I don't know. Some say 500 or 600. Do they all work in this place?" "Oh, no, sir. He got 2 to 3 places." "How many on this place?" "Over 150. What allowances have you?" "None, sir." "What, no Saturday to yourself?" "No, sir." "What, allow you Sundays, I suppose?" "No, sir. We work all day every Sunday." "How late do you work?" "Till we can't see to pick no more cotton. But when it's moonlight, we pick till 10 o'clock at night." I'm going to stop here. Wait a minute. Now, let me just say this. You know, Delaney is a man writing this book. Okay? Now, he would never even, well, first of all, this is the 19th century, so he wouldn't mention this out of the decorum of the 19th century. Understand, in the 19th century, women wore clothes from the neck to the ankle. Understand that. Now, these enslaved women just had a little frock around them which didn't hide all of their body parts. And even worse, they worked every day. I mean, some masters would indeed let their enslaved people have a Saturday off so that the enslaved people could like plant their own garden, make their own food, wash their clothes. Not here. Not here. And this is somebody, a well off white family. I'm going to get to Brother Fred. Yes, I am in a minute. That owned hundreds of enslaved people working for free from sunup to sundown. Now, I'll read more, Blake, because there's a point to be made on this plantation. Now, but I want to say something that only sisters would really think about. If these girls only had on a frock, and I can tell you, because I've read this, they didn't have underwear either. So what did them sisters have to do when they had their menses? This is something that I especially want women to consider. The horrors of enslavement. Okay, I'm going to get going because time is a fleeting, and I got to read Frederick Douglass. I have got to read what young Fred has gone through, where he is right now. Okay, I'm on chapter 6 from those of you who are following me with the Frederick Douglass narrative. My new mistress proved to be all that she appeared when I first met her at the door. Now, this is the mistress that smiled at him and just enchanted him. A woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings. She had never had a slave under her control previously to myself. And prior to her marriage, she had been dependent upon her own industry for a living. She was by trade a weaver, and by constant application to her business, she had been in good degree preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I scarcely knew how to behave towards her. She was entirely unlike any other white woman I'd ever seen. I could not approach her as I was accustomed to approach other white ladies. My early instruction was all out of place. The crouching civility, usually so acceptable, a quality in a slave, did not answer when manifested toward her. Her favor was not gained by it. She seemed to be disturbed by it. She did not deem it impudent or unmanly for a slave to look her in the face. The meanest slave was put fully at ease in her presence, and none left without feeling better for having seen her. Her face was made of heavenly smiles, and her voice of tranquil music. But alas, this kind heart had but a short time to remain such. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands, and soon commenced its infernal work. That cheerful eye, under the influence of slavery, soon became red with rage. That voice, made all of sweet accord, changed to one of harsh and horrid discord. And that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful. It was unlawful, as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, quote, if you give a nigger an inch, he will take an eel. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that nigger, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. Okay, I'm gonna stop right here. So, look what Fred Douglass discovered: a power to overcome an enslaver, an enslavement, was indeed the power to read. This is one of the many reasons I am reading to you. Because all of us, especially the young, you're growing up with a technology that is moving you away from reading books. And I do not want that to be. So I'm doing my small part, especially to remind my people that it was illegal for us to learn to read. It was unlawful, as Mr. Auld told his wife. And he said it would ruin the slave. Of course it would. The more knowledge you have, the more in control of your world you will be. That what in the 19th century, when Frederick Douglass wrote this book, and even in the 21st century, right now, you want to change the world? Get some knowledge. You want to change the world? Strengthen your mind, strengthen your body. Well, brothers and sisters, as always, it's such a pleasure to have been with you. Okay? I really want you to know that. And remember this. Remember that Henry, right? Blake, right? When he felt unstrengthened, what did he do? He prayed. What did he do? He prayed. I did a series, I did an episode on the power of prayer. Our ancestors knew that. Henry knew that. Fred Douglass knew that. Charles Ball, the last old man, knew that. You go to God. You go to your ancestors. You pull on them. And in closing, my brothers and sisters, send up a prayer for good Celia. She was once on earth, so that means her energy is still around. There's energies all around each of us and around this planet. So send up a loving prayer to that courageous sister. And in closing, remember that I always pray for you. I love you dearly, sincerely, and I look forward to hanging out with you again next Tuesday with Readings with Regina at 2 o'clock. See you then.